Good sword. All right, it's great to be here this morning. Last Sunday I was in Phnom Penh worshipping in a CMA church with a whole lot of different people in a language, of course, I couldn't understand, and they had the odd English word, but there I was. And I was there with one of the principals of the colleges, so I've met with quite a number of these people over the last month, and I've been away in Southeast Asia, so in Myanmar, Thailand, 2 colleges there, Bangladesh, and then up into Nepal, where there's quite a number of schools in Kathmandu that are doing amazing things, and then to Cambodia, and then Vietnam, which I didn't get into because my visa ran out that next day and they wouldn't let me in, which was a pain. But Phil Tate, who's my brother-in-law and works 40% of the time with us, he was able to go in. He laughed at me as he went through the gate. Didn't realise I wasn't going to get coming through. So there we are. Here I am. And I've had a couple of nights of sleep since I've been back. So it enabled me to go to Laidlaw College yesterday and to be with Myunghwa and Mark with their daughter Gina and their daughter's wedding, her second wedding, with Mino, who is the son-in-law for Myunghwa. And you know, Myunghwa's story is quite amazing. It's quite an incredible story, and she's quite an amazing woman just to get through what she did as a single mum with those 2 girls, and to see her eldest daughter get married off and her youngest daughter, who's back in Korea and going on very well for the Lord apparently, and she's back in church and willingly doing stuff for the Lord, and that's wonderful. So just give thanks for those stories. And I mention these stories because we're all in a story. And I need to ask you, what story are you in most of the time? Because this is really what Judges is all about. It's really about the nation of Israel getting caught up in the stories of the pagan nations around them and being subverted into that story like we do so often. And we live different stories. I watch Netflix. I quite enjoy watching it to escape. But the reason is that I just quite enjoy a different story that I'm currently in, and it helps me to get... And I could see all of these things in the different countries I went to. They had the odd program there in their language, of course, which I couldn't understand. But anyway, I was able to follow the ones I wanted to. Well, Judges. And my favourite character as well. And my most unfavoured character is Jephthah. There are a lot of questions in the book of Judges, actually. It raises a lot of issues for us. So, Judges, and we might want to just, before I launch into it, get onto the PowerPoint. Is it going to work? The first slide there is our little granddaughter, Millie, and I thought you might like an update. She was born about 5 weeks ago, and her name is Amelia, Millie for short. And Pearl's just loving her time over there. She'll be there 7 weeks by the time she returns on the 26th. And my other daughter, Michelle, has gone over there. So all of my girls are there at the moment. And I don't go until June. I'll go and see them then. I didn't see them this time. But Pearl is so blessed, and we're so blessed to have a granddaughter. It's part of the story we're in, and we want her to be part of the story of God, which would be wonderful. So do pray for Millie. All right, next slide. There. You do you. Yeah, I'm glad you explained it, Catherine. But it's all about that story that we're in, and the sort of thing that our culture says you can do whatever you like, you know. It won't, as long as it doesn't affect everyone else. In fact, what we do does affect other people. You can't help it. So, Judges transitions Israel from the leadership of spirit-empowered judges or deliverers to spirit-empowered human kings. In doing so, the book points to the Davidic monarchy as God's means to deliver his people, not only from the enemy nations, but also from one another and even their own sinful hearts. Judges is really quite a scary book. If not for the death of Christ, it would be the messiest book in the whole Bible. You see, it's saturated with toxic events, genocide, holy war, slavery, and the oppression of women. This tempts some to think that the Bible condones those sort of behaviours because that behaviour's in the Bible. That's not true. What the Bible does is bring to light the reality of life and how God touches that. Many have noticed that Judges isn't merely bad, it gets worse and worse throughout. And by the time you get to the end, even Sodom and Gomorrah's sins in Genesis 19 pale in comparison with the sins we find in Judges 19. And there we find, or we don't find, God mentioned much at all. He's absent. So it might appear by the end of Judges that God doesn't even want to touch Israel. They're in such a mess. But this is a great reason for us to preach on the book of Judges, particularly after we've done a series on discipleship. You see, the thing that we need to learn here, and this is one of the traps we get with young preachers and even older preachers, when we do the Old Testament, we love to do character studies, and we want to do character studies on the people. Well, unfortunately, that's not sort of why these were written about the people. They were written about God. And who's the hero of the story? It's actually God. God is the hero of the story. And in every single judge, who's the hero of the story? It is God who's the hero. And that's the lesson we need to learn. So when you think of Judges, I'm betting your mind quickly jumps to Deborah's bravery. And by the way, we're going to talk about Deborah, and we're going to talk about the role of women and all that sort of stuff when I get to do that. So I'm not covering that today in the introduction, but it's actually quite a major point in the book of Judges. Gideon's fleece or Samson's strength, those are the sort of things we might think about when we think of Judges. The first 16 chapters focus on spirit-empowered judges who look more like the Avengers than legal experts. Samson looks more like Thor than a judge today. But in truth, with the notable exception of Othniel, the book goes to great lengths to show that these human heroes are all zeros in one sense or another. You see, Barak needs Deborah to hold his hand if he's going to trust and obey God's word. And Gideon, well, Gideon does all these things to try and prove that God is there if he's going to trust him. And Gideon needs constant reaffirmation from God so that he can trust him. And what does Samson do? Samson exploits God's good gifts, his strength, and so on, for his own gain. Again and again, these human heroes reveal that salvation comes from God's initiative, not human initiative. God is the great hero of Judges. So it's not so different when we come to Judges chapter 3. Better have a look at the next slide, because this sort of just puts it in the picture. You see the Moabites, they come from that down that part. The Amalekites on the other side, and Ammon is there. Jericho's up there. Pearl and I got to drive in a bus past Jericho. It's quite a flat sort of spot. It's very stony, and you do see a lot of palms. It's in a low part of the valley before you rise up to get to Jerusalem. And walking on that road, it's very hot and very stony. So there it is. Jericho's, that's where that is, and you get a bit of an idea of where we might get to here. So God defeats his enemies with an unexpected twist in chapter 3, with a surprise in each case, and that shouldn't be unexpected for us, really, in this section of the Judges. But before we look at Judges 3, I want to say how I approach looking at Old Testament narratives as we have in Judges. I think it's helpful for us to ask 4 different questions. But before we do that, when you think about a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So it has what we call an orientation. You get all the detail that sets you up for the story, and sometimes it's a long piece and sometimes it's very short. And then you have, as the story goes along, it's not a story unless something happens. So if I just said to you, the car drove down the road, is that a story? It's not a story. But if I said to you, the car drove down the road and I heard a siren, it's almost a story. And then the car was pulled over by the cop. It's becoming a story. There's a complication, right? The complication might be a number of things. The car was speeding, the person might not have been wearing a seatbelt, they had a broken light, it could have been a whole lot of things. And, well, something has to be solved. Someone's going to have to pay a fine, or they're going to have to do something. So you have a complication, then you have a resolution. Now, Judges is not very easy to analyse like that. Quite difficult. But I want to ask 4 questions of the narrative. And when we talk about narrative, we mean story, right? And you're all in a narrative, I'm in a narrative. So here is Ehud in a narrative. But there's a number of questions we need to ask around this. So, the next slide is there. What is the story so far? What is the story about? What does this teach me about the way God does things? And what does this teach me about the way God does things through Jesus? And if we're going to deal with an Old Testament passage in a home group or in preaching, please don't stop in the Old Testament. We were given the new covenant. So how does this story point forward to Christ? And we're going to talk about all of that in relation to this story. So the first question there, we haven't gone over those. Where are we up to in God's grand narrative of his dealings with his people when we get to this story in Judges? And how does it fit into the grand sweep of God's story? And then what do we learn about God, his character, his plans, and his purposes? And what does this teach me about the way God does things through Jesus? Those are 4 very important questions. In the end, the Bible is clear that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Prophecies and expectations and promises. So the Old Testament, the whole of it, is like a giant billboard pointing to Jesus. So we must ask those questions. So, the first question, what is the story so far? Well, we know from Joshua, from his time, that God's people have been brought out of Egypt by God into and through extraordinary circumstances. And having wandered around the wilderness for 40 years, they've begun their conquest of the promised land. But as we come to the book of Judges, Joshua has just died, and Israel must now continue to conquer the land, driving out the pagan nations as God had commanded. That was what he wanted. And when you read through that, you know why. I was talking about allegiances to other gods and all sorts of things, and intermarriage, which would actually disrupt the people of Israel and turn them into sinful idolaters. But there was a major problem in that they weren't fully occupying the land. They hadn't done things the way that God had commanded. And the wheels, in a sense, were starting to come off the whole thing. So Israel was simply unable to drive out those occupying forces. But it wasn't because of the iron chariots of the Canaanites or the fortified cities. It was simply because of Israel's faithlessness. They started living the stories of the people around them. They started immersing themselves in those worlds and not the world of God and the Old Testament sacrifices and things that would point to God. So there was a disobedience in the heart of Israel. There was a rebellion within her. And so we see this pattern starting to occur in Israel's life, where we can see Israel's faithlessness being lived out time after time, contrasted with God's faithfulness shown both in his judgment but also in his graciousness towards his people as he saves and delivers Israel. And in chapter 3 we see the first example of this pattern, starting with the life of Othniel. Verses 7 and 8. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Ashereths. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. That's so difficult to read, isn't it? To whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. This generation arises. They forget God and his promises and serve false gods. And God is angry with them and gives them over to enemy nations who oppress them. Verses 9 to 11. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So we see here that God has mercy on them and saves them. So we might want to go to the next slide, because we see this cycle beginning to happen, and this is what happens right through with the judges. We see that it is God who delivers them as he sends his Spirit on Othniel. And Othniel, as the first, is a great example of what it meant to be a judge in Israel. He wasn't just an administrator, like we think of a judge today. He was that. But he was also a deliverer in a military sense, the combination of the two. So God raises up people and calls them judges in this period of Israel's history, and they're used by him to save his people and rule over them. And Othniel is a great example for us to start off with. And so begins this cycle. Sin, slavery, oppression, and this oppression causes them to call out to God. It causes them to realize the story that they are in, and they are submersed in, and they cannot get out. And so they call out to God. It's often our story too, isn't it? And salvation comes. Okay, so we go back to this next slide. What is the story about? What is the story here in chapter 3 about? Well, somewhat ominously, we are told in verse 11 that Othniel died. His career as a judge lasted all of 3 verses, not very long when you compare it with the next judge. What's going to happen next? Well, given Israel's track record, we can guess that it's not going to be very pretty. And sure enough, we see this cycle of peace and rebellion, judgment and deliverance begin to be repeated from here up to chapter 16. And over those chapters, we see that same story repeated all over Israel and in all the tribes across Israel. And today we're looking at Ehud, and his story runs from verse 12. And I'm going to read it again in a minute. The cycle begins. Israel rebels against God. God judges them by giving Moab, that place on the left of the map, the left of the big lake, the right actually. The Ammonites are on the other side. He gives Moab power over them and possession of the city of palms, which is Jericho. Israel deserved it, but they cry out to God for mercy, and in response, he raises up Ehud as a deliverer. And, of course, we were well expressed through Phil that he was a left-hander. And, of course, that's a little bit unusual. Ehud was not from Judah, but Benjamin. And if Judah was the healthiest of the tribes, Benjamin is pictured, particularly in the book of Judges, as being the least healthy of all the tribes. In chapters 19 through 21, we're told the tragic tales of the sins of the Benjaminites. Those sins are so bad, they prompt the other Jewish tribes, with Yahweh's help, to war against the men of Benjamin, and they greatly reduce the number of men in the tribe of Benjamin on purpose, because they're hopeless people. They're terrible. They'll lead you away from God. And by the way, don't let any of your sons marry those women from Benjamin, or the other way around. They didn't want into marriage. However, Ehud's prowess is seen in verses 15 and 16. In verses 15, he's described as a left-handed man. Now, another thing about Old Testament narrative and any narrative in the Bible is whenever you get a description about anything, you know Elijah, what was his description? Can you remember? He was noted as being a hairy man. And that hairy man idea is carried right through into the New Testament with John the Baptist. In other words, he's a type of Elijah. He's hairy as well. And you see the narrators using these little terms. So whenever you see a description in the Bible, it's very important. What is said is very important, and what is not said is very important. So when you analyse and think about the narrative, don't just think about the instructions we're being given or not given. Think about all the other descriptions going on and things that aren't there or are there, and they're important. In this case, it's a left-handed guy. Well, a left-handed guy is not going to keep his sword down here, because the fastest way to use a sword is to draw it from this side, because you've got power coming out of your arm when you do it. So a right-handed person would have their sword on their left leg, left hip, because they can use it very quickly. Ehud is a left-handed man. In fact, the left-handed term actually in the Hebrew means more ambidextrous than just left-handed. So he was a very skilled man and a skilled warrior. In fact, the Benjaminites were known for their left-handed or ambidextrous warriors. They could fight with both hands. Today, these sort of fellows would be in the special forces. They'd be in our armed defenders squad. They're really cool. They're really good at what they do. Well, this is an interesting contrast between Ehud, a Benjaminite, and Othniel, who came from the classy end of town with a good heritage. Ehud's from the small, insignificant tribe of Benjamin, and to top it all off, he's a left-hander. So why mention it? Because it is so unusual, that's why it's mentioned. And it sometimes is mentioned when you listen to sports broadcasts, when I watch a lot of cricket. And when they talk about left-handers, they talk about left-handers. They don't talk about right-handers. And boxers. What's a boxer know? And what's the term for a left-handed boxer? Sophomore. Because it's unusual. And if you're going to fight a left-hander, you've got better school yourself up on how to do it, because it's really hard to do that. I used to find that with table tennis, playing left-handed table tennis players were harder than right-handed ones for me. So Ehud is an unlikely left-handed champion from obscurity. So how does he deliver? Let's have a look at the next slide. Let's read the story from verse 12 again, because just think now of the terms that are used here. So I'm just going to read off my phone, which isn't the same as up there, but you'll get it. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel because of their evil. Eglon enlisted the Ammonites and the Amalekites as allies, those three places on the map, remember? And then he went out and defeated Israel, taking possession of Jericho, the city of palms. And the Israelites served Eglon of Moab for 18 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord again raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Ehud, son of Gerar, a left-handed man of the tribe of Benjamin. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver their tribute to King Eglon of Moab. So, and these details are important. Ehud made a double-edged dagger that was about 1 foot long. It wasn't just sharp on one side, it was sharp on both, because he knew that, as you're bringing your sword up, it's got to be able to cut from both sides to make it work well. He strapped it to his right thigh, keeping it hidden under his clothing. He brought the tribute money to Eglon, who was very fat again, very descriptive, and it's there for a reason, because he was huge. And I was often just thinking, this guy's probably big and he's probably tall as well, and he's sitting there in this chair, and he's just going to get up to approach Ehud. We'll see that in a minute. After delivering the payment, Ehud started home with those who had helped carry the tribute. I wonder if he was actually meaning to do this earlier, but he hadn't had a chance to have entrance into the king's court. When Ehud reached the stone idols near Gilgal, might have been a reminder for him of the other gods, and we're not going to be subservient to these other gods. He came to Eglon and said, "I have a secret message for you." So the king commanded his servants, "Be quiet," and he sent them all out of the room. And Ehud was going to deliver this secret. It was going to be, and I reckon he must have lowered his voice. So he would come close to the king, and the king got up to approach him. Ehud says, and this is a repetition again, and repetition's important, "I have a message from God for you." As King Eglon rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, pulled out the dagger, strapped to his right thigh, plunged it into the king's belly. The dagger went so deep the handle disappeared beneath the king's fat. So Ehud did not pull out the dagger, and the king's bowels emptied. It's very graphic, but it's there for a reason. and it's meant to make you wheezy. All right? My kids told me that they were often traumatized with some of the stuff we showed them about, the stories in the Bible and videos of Christian martyrs. Ehud closed and locked the doors of the room and escaped down the latrine. So he got out the back of the toilet. After Ehud was gone, the king's servants returned and found the doors to the upstairs room locked. They thought he might be using the latrine in the room, so they waited because they could smell it. Well done, Phil. Very graphic. Wow. They got the key and they opened the doors and they found their master dead on the floor. While the servants were waiting, this gave Ehud time to escape. And he passed the stone idols on his way to Seirah. When he arrived in the hill country of Ephraim, Ehud sounded a call to arms. Then he led a band of Israelites down the hills. "Follow me," he said, "for the Lord has given your victory over Moab, your enemy." So they followed him. The Israelites took control of the shallow crossings of the Jordan River across Moab, preventing anyone from crossing. They attacked the Moabites and killed about 10,000 of their strongest and most able-bodied warriors. Not one of them escaped. So Moab was conquered by Israel that day, and there was peace in the land for 80 years. Quite a story. And what would happen right now if I took all of this off the screen and got you to retell the story back to me? Would you remember the details? They're pretty graphic. You probably would. We should do that more often. We should tell these stories because we need to be immersed in them. But we need to remember the parts that are really important about them. And we could ask ourselves questions, and one day I should try and do a sermon that way with you, with a narrative. But because I'm introducing it today, I want to bring a few other points to your attention. Anyway, Ehud is this unlikely left-handed champion from obscurity. So, how does he deliver? He delivers in almost a farcical way. It seems a little crazy, doesn't it? It's a little humorous, in fact, to the point of wanting us to laugh out loud. It's almost ridiculous how easy it was for Ehud to kill the king. He used the old secret message for the king trick. Sort of Maxwell Smart style, if some of you remember Maxwell Smart. Eglon was certainly a very fat man, but he was also very stupid. Ehud, with his sword strapped on his opposite leg to normal, whips it out and makes his point with Eglon. It really is a joke. The narrative is written like a joke. Do we get the point? We even have a bit of toilet humour thrown in for good measure, with the attendants thinking the king has relieved himself and waiting for him to the point of embarrassment. Well, what is the point? There are two things, and that's on the next slide. Firstly, it's remarkable how easily God defeats his enemies. It's pathetic, really, how nations and kings think they can stand up to the Lord of the universe. God's enemies are no match for him, and this event makes that painfully clear. You could say Eglon got the point. We see the same in verse 31, stuck on the end of the passage. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. So one man, armed with an ox goad, a long metal implement pointed at one end, used to drive oxes, or oxen. It was a nasty device. But you know what? It wasn't a submachine gun. It was one thing. And this guy killed 600 Philistines with it. That's pretty amazing. It's ridiculous how easy God defeats his enemies. The picture comes up again. And the second point that's being made is that it's surprising and it's unexpected, both who God uses and how God does it. Who and how he chooses to deliver his people. We have a left-hander from nowhere with his sword strapped to his right thigh unexpectedly, and he delivers Israel from the Moabites. So you know what? We should expect the unexpected with God, right? As we see God at work, as we read these chapters in Judges. And then the third thing we need to think about is, what does this teach me about the way God does things? The big thing is one that echoes right through the book of Judges, that God is serious about sin. God will judge sin both inside and outside Israel. Notice that every time Israel rebels, who is it that raises up one of the surrounding nations against Israel? Who is it? God himself raises up the nations around about Israel to judge Israel. And then it is God who also provides a deliverer. He is in control. He will judge his people when they rebel. You see, God is serious about sin. And of course, I try to use other words apart from sin when I talk to people about my Christian faith these days, because a lot of people don't understand sin. But I think one of the ways we can understand it, that I've already said and shared with you, is that we get caught up in another story. It's not the story of the gospel. It's not the story of Christ or the story of the Bible. And when we get caught up into that, that's it. That's going to lead us into other passions and other desires and things that are not healthy for us or good for us. And so that is what sin is. And Israel was caught up into this. We place ourselves in other stories to find ourselves. So what story have you been placing yourself in to find yourself? At the same time, we see that God is also gracious. He hears and remembers his people when they cry out to them. He saves them and he delivers them, not because he has to, but because he loves them. I just love it how God races after us graciously. And as already mentioned, we see how easy God defeats his enemies. It's almost comical how he uses people like Ehud and Shamgar to deliver his people from their enemies. Now, he's not making fun of Ehud or of Shamgar, but he's poking fun at his enemies as he shows them how foolish it is to dare stand up to the one true God. If Israel has failed to conquer the land and drive out the pagans, it's not because God's not able or powerful enough to do it. Instead, he shows it is he who conquers by doing the unexpected, by using the unusual people. The left-handed guy from nowhere who keeps his sword in strange places, the man who kills hundreds with an ox goad. God is serious about sin. But we have to learn to expect the unexpected in the way that God does that. So lastly, what does this teach me about the way God does things through Jesus? Well, the whole of the Old Testament is like a one-way street, with Jesus standing at the far end of it. And we always need to look for the signpost that points towards him. Every time we open the Old Testament, we need to ask, how is this pointing me to Jesus? And this is one of the reasons we have the Lord's Supper, and I quite often like to share this, because it points us to Jesus, and we need that. We need that help, because so often we're looking elsewhere. This is essential if we are to understand the Old Testament in the way it's intended to be understood on the other side of the cross and after the resurrection. We've said already that one big issue in Judges is Israel's evil and rebellious heart, and how their faithlessness kept on causing problem after problem. The judges are only temporary, and we can already see the book is screaming out for a solution to this ongoing problem of Israel's sin and faithlessness, and they're chasing after other things and being in other stories. The unwritten question that the book keeps asking is this: who will deal once and for all with that issue? Who will fix the ongoing problem of the evil heart of Israel and our evil hearts? And the answer, of course, is Jesus at the cross. Judges also alerts us to how God will defeat his enemies with ease. And we see that too at the cross. We see not a cheap and easy victory in the sense that it didn't cost God something. In fact, the cost was huge, but the victory was total. It was a total victory. It was a massive triumph for God. And we read about this in Colossians, where Paul writes in 2:15 there, Colossians 2:15, that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, and he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Do you know, it was never a close match for God. It was not like that hard-fought score in the last seconds footy match between God and evil. No, never. God's victory is clear and absolute. It's a costly victory, but it's also a total victory. And once again, this tells us to expect the unexpected from God. I mean, who would have picked it? God come in the flesh as a little baby, God needing his nappies changed, and then him going to the cross, dying a criminal's death to buy back his people. Totally unexpected things. So what does Judges say to us today? Well, this passage gives us a warning and an encouragement. The warning is this: we've seen how God overcomes his enemies with ease. And if you're here today and you're not 100% on God's side, then this is a powerful warning to you. It's a powerful warning to me. If you're on the wrong side of God, then hear the warning. God will defeat his enemies with ease. And if we're not 100% for God, then we are his enemy. And we need to realise the foolishness and danger of that position, of being in that story. And then the encouragement. Sometimes we feel as Christians, as we look around the world and the state of Christianity in this part of the world, that we are in a losing battle. We see the opposition building up, and the risks of following Jesus increasing. It's difficult. It's easy to feel behind the eight ball and that we have a weak and puny message. But Judges reminds us that it's often through the weak and the puny, the seemingly insignificant, unsuccessful, and it's through those people that God works in unexpected ways. Isn't that amazing? That gives you and me hope. And he works powerfully. Let's pray that he would be pleased to work in that way in and through us. Now, I have the privilege of being in different places and learning some things about the state of the church. So I'll just tell you a couple of things for you just to understand that we might feel a little bit down here in New Zealand. Things aren't going well, our churches, the numbers are dropping and so on. Well, I was in Thailand. Thailand's not known for its great numbers of Christians, right? It's 0.5%. So there's 500,000 Christians in Thailand. I go and have a meeting with the principal of Bangkok Bible College, and his name is Manot. Manot he's a graduate of SAIX, by the way, and he was one of Graham Houghton's, some of you know what I'm talking about, little protégés early in SAIX history. Did his master's there and then he did his doctorate somewhere else. Manot is also the chair of the equivalent of Vision Network New Zealand with these 500,000 Christians. They have a goal. They call it Love Thailand 111. It's a goal for 2030. Their goal is to double the number of Christians between now and 2030 and to plant 10,000 churches. And they're going to do it. And they're getting people excited about it. I didn't get into Vietnam, but Phil tells me that the school there, which doesn't have a master's degree yet, and they're struggling to teach in English, they teach in Vietnamese, but they have, at the moment, well over 200 students. Their goal is to have 800 students. Why? It's part of the CMA, Christian Missionary Alliance congregation. It was planted as a Bible college by that group. It's now become the Evangelical Free Church of Vietnam. Just in Hanoi alone, which is about the population of New Zealand, 60 new church plants in the last year in their denomination. 60. Brand new church plants. Where are they going to get the leaders? And they're wanting to grow their student numbers to 800. And they're building a new 6-story building to do it. God is at work through people who struggle with all sorts of, and that's what all these schools are struggling in many, many different ways. And my role, part of Lee Deb Langham's role, is to facilitate, to help them where they need help. And God uses people like you and me to help. And one of their biggest needs is English. as a second language. So if you've got some time on your hands over the next 2 or 3 years, please, and you think your job is done, there's some work to be done to lift these colleges so they have leaders who can understand the Word of God better, can use the English materials because they have hardly, that library has 700 books in Vietnam, in Hanoi. That's all they've got, 700 books. In Thailand, they have 1,000 books in English, and they've got a whole lot more in Thai, but it's a struggle for them. And this is an area we can do something to help them in. We can be God's ehud to bring our gift to use for the sake of helping the people of God in their time of need. May God give us the grace to see His greatness and power, not only to use our weak selves for His service, but also to deliver us forever from the hold of sin. It's great. We'll talk a bit more about this in the next few weeks. Thanks. Thanks, Phil.